Once more, good afternoon. We hope you enjoyed your lunch, and welcome back to the afternoon session. If I draw your attention to the program, you will find out that we are behind schedule. So what will happen now is that we'll focus our attention to session number 6. And after that, we'll have 2 parallel sessions to take care of session number 5, which is taking stock, consolidating the social protection gains. Then alongside, we shall have revisiting the mix of social protection, the need for expansion, and also innovation. So we'll have 2 parallel sessions. So without further ado, allow me to invite the chair for this session, Ms. Nicola Yon Muti Murefu from Zimbabwe, who's going to further give us instructions and invite the next speaker. I thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, allow me to say all protocol observed. I have the honor of chairing this session, and because of the stipulated time limits, I'll just introduce. The session is being done by Professor Maurice Olivier. We all know him. He's distinguished in the area of social protection elements, and he has published widely and has rendered comprehensive services to international, regional, and to several governments, social security institutions, and to development agencies and donor institutions in social security, social protection, labor law, and migration. He has developed several policies for government and social security institutions. He's the chairperson of the Southern African Social Protection Expert Network Board of Trustees. So let me welcome him, Prof. And let's give him a round of applause as he comes to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chair, for inviting me to speak here. Ladies and gentlemen, we are behind time, so I'm aware of that. The presentation I'm going to make will, I assume, will be made available to you because there's much more in the written version of the presentation as what I would be able to present. If we could, I see it's uploaded there. So some of the slides I'll just move quite quickly, others I'll stop and have a bit of a reflection. We try to kind of stand back and ask ourselves, what have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? And in particular, building on what so many other speakers already covered, including the keynote speaker earlier this morning, what do we take from here? And how can we build our systems of social protection in the region? What I've decided to do is to focus, as you can see on the title, on 2 distinct areas, and they're actually both of them quite loaded. So we have to see how we manage our time. The one is to talk a bit about the need for calibrated and integrated approaches. Because I think that we have, at least until now, too little of that reflected in our countries. calibrating integrated social protection responses. And then I want to talk about developmental social protection responses, and I will do so with reference to particular vulnerable categories. And the three that I've chosen, and we might not be able to discuss all three. In the first place, informal economy workers. Secondly, migrant workers, African migrant workers. And thirdly, those who are exposed to climate change, both internally displaced people as a result of climate change, but also those displaced across borders. And then to make a few conclusions. I'm afraid we won't have time to discuss all of this. Some of what we will be discussing probably is a bit, how can I say, these are modern approaches that we see elsewhere in the world, especially as far as the first topic is concerned, calibrated integrated approaches. Not enough yet of that in Africa, and yet if there's one thing that we've learned from COVID-19 is that we really have to look at a new, innovative ways in which we deal with social protection for our continent and our countries. Right, so the current experience in most SADC countries we are suggesting to you is a silo approach. We have our contributory schemes on the one hand and our non-contributory schemes. There's very little interaction between the two. Institutionally, they are separated. Legally, they are separated. And so we have come for many, many decades. COVID-19, however, has prompted the need for an integrated and calibrated approach we suggest to you. What is the rationale for this? Because if we have an integrated and calibrated approach, we would certainly, achieve more of a full, if not in a complete coverage, or at least coverage extension in our region, both in terms of who are being covered and also the quality of coverage. Issues touched upon already this morning in several presentations. It will then give expression to the human rights imperative, also highlighted by the keynote speaker by Stephen Devereux this morning. It is, in the first place, a human rights issue that everyone is entitled to social protection. And certainly the SDG principle of leave no one behind. These are absolutely critical matters for us in Africa and in the SADC region in particular. Now, when we talk about integrated and calibrated approaches, the lessons that I want to take primarily at this stage, not from Africa, because according to my knowledge, there are not many countries, doing what I'm going to discuss now, although there's some thinking even in this country on this matter, and I'll come back to that. But we see these developments, and I'm talking purely about the developing world. I'm not even looking at the so-called developed world. We have seen very interesting, phenomenal actually, developments in some ASEAN countries, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, etc. Quite a bit of this in the Latin American experience. And the South African policy proposals for when South Africa eventually is going to establish a comprehensive social security system, there's quite a bit of thinking that went into this kind of integrated, calibrated framework. I'll give you the details within a moment. And the first point I want to make in this regard is that our contributory schemes in some places in the world actually have a mixed character. They accommodate also non-contributory elements. And how does this happen? We see it, I must add, if I said Africa doesn't have examples, it's not wholly true. In some African countries where attempts have been made to establish informal economy, social protection focused scheme, we see some of what I'm going to say, even though these schemes may still be in their infancy. And that is where governments would come and provide for support for these contributory schemes. And they would do it at least in two ways, if not more, or three ways. First, they provide incentives. Secondly, importantly, at times they take up the tab to provide the contributions for the ultra poor. Very interesting development. And thirdly, what we also see is that, for example, in the area of national health insurance, what governments would also do is to take care fully or for reduced co-payments by the beneficiaries of the scheme. So a number of interesting examples of how contributory arrangements are actually influenced by non-contributory support. Next slide, please. How is this being achieved? Let me quickly rush through this. That in the one hand, we have universal benefits regimes, if I could use that term, universal tax-supported social protection benefits. A few countries in the region, Namibia, for example, has a social pension scheme, which is kind of universal. There's no means testing involved. But then importantly, if we talk about contributory arrangements, universal national social insurance schemes has already funded in part by contributions or subsidies on the part of government. National health insurance schemes is a good example. So secondly, the building of a multi-tier regime. Now this is actually very important, and the South African Department of Social Development would be able to tell about the good thinking has gone into this for the model for this country. That is to say that, whether contributor or non-contributor, they are supposed to all fit together. And in its simplest form, you would have as a baseline level, let's say, non-contributory arrangements. And then on top of this, you build your contributory arrangements. And then thirdly, you make room for voluntary supplementary contributions. Now, it's not just a matter of building these pillars, but to calibrate them. You see exactly how far do you go with your non-contributory schemes, where exactly does the contributory arrangements kick in, and then, of course, the voluntary tier, in a way which will make it possible for as many people as possible to contribute, to make sure that people do not fall through the cracks, etc., etc. And you can do it. There are some wonderful examples in the developing world out there. Next slide, please. But of course, there could be challenges, and I think the Indonesian example is a good one, the health insurance scheme. The government in Indonesia fully subsidizing those below the poverty line. And for those who are informal workers, self-employed, they provided different categories, classify them according to 3 categories of contributors. The problem is that many of those informal economy, self-employed people do not get the government subsidies, and yet they are poor. So the criticism that has been expressed is that it places undue financial pressure on those above the poverty line, but who are nevertheless poor, informal workers. So the calibration has to be done carefully, and there's a lot of expertise in this regard. Contributory schemes are unlikely to ever achieve full coverage. That, I think, needs to be said, especially amongst the poorest. So we always need proper non-contributory arrangement. Important thing here is the alignment. The solidarity component, therefore, is an important consideration to achieve universal coverage. What are needed, therefore, are, firstly, a proper alignment, calibration, if you like, of contributor and non-contributor components, and secondly, more accurate targeting methods to determine who falls into the subsidized categories. If I had more time, I would have given you a few very interesting examples of how Thailand has done it, how Vietnam has done it in its social health insurance. And the one message is that this doesn't happen overnight. This kind of integrated, calibrated system very often is built gradually. And I think it's important for the continent to draw on the expertise. I know that the ILO in particular, they work on this. They've got a lot of good expertise. In fact, when you receive the slides, you'll see that it actually fits in also to a large extent with the model of the social protection floors, which have the kind of the horizontal expansion in the first place, and then secondly also the vertical expansion, increasing coverage for a larger and increasing number of people. Next slide, please. Now, on the coverage dimensions, I'm really just going to highlight a few issues because, we don't want to overstep the time that we have. I think Stephen Devereaux mentioned this already, that while only 47% of the world's population have access to at least one social security benefit, the position in Africa is only 17.4%. So we see the deficiency in the continent and the need to do something seriously. Next slide, please. Now, I don't even have time to give you a summary of some of the key problems that we are experiencing with our contributory, and next slide, our non-contributory schemes. Just to say that, for example, on the contributory side, still very much the contributory schemes are focused on those in the employment relationship. So by and large, excluding those in the informal economy, unless specialized arrangements are being made or are made for those in informal economy. Our non-contributory schemes, they are weakly developed in Africa in particular. We see encouraging signs of broader-based rollout of broader-based non-contributory social assistance and other arrangements. But there are many issues, still many, funding, of course, is also part of the issue, but there are funding models out there. Next slide. So if we, also in this area, we have several international standards out there in social protection. The problem, even in our region, is that many of these standards have not yet been sufficiently ratified. And even if they're ratified, they still need to be implemented. And the adjustment then of the domestic legal system, for example, that is quite a challenge. Next slide, please. Now, if we talk about the informal economy as such, these are figures from the ILO 2018 statistical report, that 2 billion of the world's employed population actually work informally. It's no less than 61%. But look at Africa, almost 86%. And those are the people who mostly fall through the cracks. Next slide, please. Who are these people? Well, the profile of these people, we don't have time to discuss it, but you can see who are mostly affected, the young, the old, and in our part of the world, there are gender dimensions too. Next slide, please. Adverse impact on access to social protection for these people. One of the reasons is that most of our social security schemes are developed or designed for, the contributory schemes are designed for those who work in the formal sector within an employment relationship. There are also problems with the 9 classical social security risk framework. They're very important. But our experience in the developing world is that there are also other needs, social risks, to which people in the informal economy are exposed to. And the one that I really would like to mention is the loss of income generating tools or facilities. The moment the person who is in the informal economy, that person loses his ability to ply his or her trade with whatever he has, let's say a sewing machine or whatever the case may be, then that very loss is a basis for the loss of income. So it becomes a risk. And that's a kind of risk that could, and in my view, actually should be secured or insured. Nothing new for Africa perhaps, but I remember when I did some work with the ILO in India a few years ago, I was actually amazed to see how many of these insurance-based income-generating tool loss, if you like, or facilities loss, insurance-based arrangements are in place at the level of the Indian states, the different states in India. So we need specialized approaches for those in the formal economy. Next slide, please. Right. Now, the good news, of course, when you talk about informal economy, although much more can be done, it's very difficult to systematize what I'm going to say. You don't need to always systematize as well. I have to say that as well. But even just on a practical level, we see an amazing and fast-growing range of special measures and mechanisms that are adopted by by governments, or sometimes even private role players, to establish arrangements or schemes to cover those in the informal economy. It's really an amazing story. One of the most recent publications is a UNDP publication on this very issue. of about a year or so ago. Really a very good publication, which I would encourage you to get hold of. So for Africa, that is perhaps the leading work. The ILO has also published quite a bit more internationally and in ASEAN. We need flexibility, specialized arrangement to do all of this. We don't have time to discuss this now. Next slide, please. How far are we? Another 3 minutes? Okay, right. So I'm not going to talk about platform workers. Maybe we should just go straight into the concluding session at the very end. That's the last 2 slides, I believe. Please carry on. There we are. Okay, colleagues, the rest you can actually then find on the slide. I think in my view, not just in my view, in the view of many of us who work in this area, there's a need to support low-income and low-middle-income countries in the development of their social protection systems. And COVID-19 has stressed the need for that. There's a need for technical support. Some of these scheme design issues are very, very technical, and you need to have financing models available as well. All very technical. System design, actuarial work, capacity building is needed. But it can be done. It is currently being done even in Africa, many African countries, as far as informal economy, at least workers are concerned. To strengthen and build on and formalize social protection extension modalities pertaining to informal economy and non-standard workers, but also migrant workers. We're seeing very interesting developments in relation to coverage for migrant workers. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to discuss this. We have to address deficiencies regarding the following. There are some conceptual innovation, if you like, that we need to have. I already mentioned the issue of we need to have, in my view, an extended risk concept of what are the social risk and the social security risks that we cover. For example, for those in informal economy. And also, even though we didn't have time to discuss this, for those exposed to climate change. We need specialized arrangements for that. We need the normative provisions are inadequate. Good work was done also by ILO in the recommendation 204 of 2015 on transitioning to the formal economy. But all that it provides is actually a framework, very good framework, but the hard work still needs to be done how to do that. We don't have the normative provisions in social protection for those exposed to climate change. It's actually non-existing, frightening. Next final slide, please. We need to link coverage extension to and give expression to overarching normative and guiding global frameworks. And this should actually be our starting point. The SDGs, as far as migration is concerned, the 2018 Global Compacts. Very recently, the Secretary General of the UN's high-level panel on internal displacement, really giving good guidance as to how we should proceed, but then also to associated United Nations and ILO awareness and programmatic initiatives. It is effectively a development-focused approach that we should have. And let me say, the interesting thing is, if you look at all of these categories, even those that we couldn't discuss, the one message that increasingly is being portrayed at all levels, ILO, UN, the realization that there is or is supposed to be a social contract between the state, represented by the government, of course, and its people. And that should be the baseline for proper coverage extension and new arrangements. Sorry, that's all that we have time for. Over to you, Chair. Thank you. Is there a question, Tom? So let me move out.
Okay, Vincent said I must set this aside. Okay, because of time, I'll open up the floor for questions virtually, physically, for 10 minutes, and we'll keep strictly to that 10 minutes. Do we have any questions from the floor? I know it's hard coming from lunch, we're full, we want to sleep, but maybe having a bit of questions. Yes, one. Can I have another two, three? Yes, Fitz. Others? Okay, Richard, you can come to the front.
Professor, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation, and as usual, you make me remember those notes. Always powerful. I think that my comment is on your conclusion and that element of linking coverage extensions. And I was wondering, looking at the whole issue on calibration and looking at the African economies, as it were, and the aspect of flexibility. You have raised the issue of that even if we were to cover as much as possible, not everybody will be covered, even if it were mandatory. The question then that we need to ask ourselves, how do we synergize the social protection flaws and the contributory? Because in the morning, Prof was talking about, and I remember you are the one who also talked about it, the issue of, Prof talked about the top-up, probably the government subsidizing. And probably that may also promote the element of saving in Africa because the saving culture is quite low. But again, even if you made it mandatory, in a continent where almost on average 50% of the population is poor, to what extent will you go? You have gone further and said that in doing it, we need to link it to SDG. Can we also talk about domesticating SDGs with the lens of Africa? Because probably, so that we look at SDG goals. And what we have learned about COVID-19, is it time we revisited the traditional social protection? Because if the modern social protection as it is, during COVID-19, we realized it didn't deliver much. Is it time we begin looking at how the traditional social protection mechanisms can work and enhance delivery of social protection? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Fitz, can you come? Then Prof will respond.
Thank you, Chair. And also, thank you, Marius, from my side. We've listened to you, and there were quite comprehensive recommendations that you've made at the conclusion of your presentation. I would be very interested, without prompting you to give a second presentation, but where do you see the political points of entry? Who has to be responding to these recommendations? Who needs to be engaged? And perhaps as an expansion of these, where do you see the major obstacles to move ahead when it comes to making social protection more effective and more comprehensive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Maybe I'll give you time to answer to those two questions, unless we have any other questions that people have come up with. Naka, do we have any online questions? No, okay, thank you.
When you stand here, you feel very sanitized, I must say. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for both interventions, Rory. Yes, I hear the sentiments, and I agree fully with you. There's not much actually that I could add. Let me, however, say one or two things. The how to synergize social protection floors and the contributory system is one of the issues you raised. If you analyze actually, for example, the ILO social protection floors recommendation, it actually suggests that you can also do this, should also do it partly through contributory arrangements. But how far you will get, of course, is another question. You need this kind of mixed approach. And especially if you look at the vertical expansion, we say, okay, we extend horizontally a basic floor of protection to everybody, and that could be made up through contributory and contributory arrangements, a mix, and even some other initiatives indicated by the ILO in recommendation 204. Then you also have to look at the vertical. How do we then strengthen at least the quality of social insurance and also the scope of the range of risks, social risks that we covered, as was mentioned this morning in the keynote speech. You have to work on both of this. It's a gradual approach. Countries are certainly buying into the social protection floors, not just idea, they're really implementing this. So what we are talking about here today is how to take this further, how to kind of synergize this better, how to calibrate this. And let me say this also, you don't have to be a rich country to be able to do so. Integration and calibration could, in fact, I think it's emphatic, actually should happen even for our lower income countries. What you can do is you just have to sit down, work with the experts and see how you can better align your system, that it could serve more people better. And the examples that we have in Latin America of how countries are doing it there, and Asian countries, and some of our informal economy schemes in Africa, I think we have quite a bit of examples as far as that is concerned. Yes, I agree with you. There's a need to adapt our traditional approaches, to look at an alternative way. Otherwise, we're never going to get our people covered in the continent. And we know that is our major concern. So good work out there can be done, should be done. And I know, as I've said, in South African scenario, really some good thinking has gone into this. And we're looking forward to see how the rest of the continent will also do this. Thank you, Fritz, for this very important question about what is your political point of entry and what are the obstacles. Your obstacles could, of course, be that you may have a non-interested government, that you have a government which says that we don't feel we're up to it, we're not able to do so. But I think the point of entry, the political point of entry, could be varied. I must say, and what I'm going to say now, I've seen especially in relation to the extension of social protection coverage to those in informal economy. I think I may have told you before, colleagues, that when I started working on this particular topic of social protection for those in informal economy about 15, 20 years ago, there was almost nothing happening in Africa. And when I stand back and I say, wow, what have our governments not done in Kenya, in Ghana, even in our region, to try and establish some arrangements for our people in informal economy. And they've done it innovatively. Of course, so many problems, there are small schemes. Look beyond this. There's a notion and understanding of a social contract with many governments, and we are there as people involved in research and advocacy to push that with our governments. And do they know it's a sensitive point? That is their potential electoral base too. So unlike 10, 15 years ago, there is a sense. Secondly, I would suggest, Fritz, that at least what we can do is to offer to our governments our assistance as researchers, as technicians in social protection, as political organizations, to say it can be done. You know, the expertise is there. Even within a continent, there are very able people who can do this. Think of the ILO as an organization as well, who really specializes in this. It can be done, and to assist governments and to offer this. And then, of course, I would suggest to use a few push factors. And the one ideal push factor, I think, would be to use the union movement in particular, because it's their workers who are also being affected. And hopefully they also have a sense for those in the informal economy, to really urge them to become involved in this and give them the assistance as well, you know, the ideas, and tell them the technical assistance is out there. And every country can do it. It takes a bit of work and it will take time, and you build this incrementally. But absolutely, I would support. There's probably much more to say. If I had time or have time, I'll think about this and even revert to you. But we want to make this work for the continent, to see our people covered, better covered, in a way where social protection becomes more broadly available and with better quality of coverage too. And this is but one very important approach, this integrated, calibrated nature of building our social protection systems. And wonderful, you know, again, if I tell you what I've seen in some of the Asian countries and what I've heard about the Latin American countries, it's really amazing. It's not smooth sailing all the way, but it has made such a difference. I mean, I did work for the ILO in Vietnam last 2 years, and what they have done in building a social health insurance system for their people using these techniques, you wouldn't believe where they came from and where they are now. And they're not a rich country. So we can also do that. I know I'm simplifying matters, but thank you.
Yep. Sorry. Are there any more burning questions? Going once, going twice? Okay. Then I'll just conclude by saying Prof. Olivia raised very pertinent issues, maybe that we can conclude on, saying that there is need for a calibrated and integrated and developmental social protection response. Contributory and non-contributory arrangements are supposed to work together. In short, a tag team, and people will not fall through the cracks. We need equality of coverage. And as I heard in a Kenyan presentation today by Richard, though not word for word, we are all in the same storm, but we are in different boats. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Apparently, SASPEN allows me to chair. I've got the next session as well. And may I call to, it's a panel discussion. And may I call to the front Dr. Isaac Kabelenga from Zambia, Mr. Wezi Shamba from Malawi, Ms. Nakata Ntombri from Somalia, Ms. Lima Moti from Swaziland to come to the podium. Thank you. They're going to sit there. They're supposed to sit there, right? And as they make their way to the seats, let me just introduce them. We only got the two ladies. The only two of them. We're supposed to have 1 hour, 5 minutes, but I see there's so 3 of them. Okay. So we've got Dr. Isaac Kabelinga from Zambia, who is a lecturer for undergraduate and postgraduate studies at the University of Zambia, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Department of Social Development Studies. Isaac is also the founder of Zambian Center for Poverty Reduction and Research Limited, where he's a senior researcher in the Department of Social Protection. We have Mr. Wezi Galeria Shamba from Malawi, who is a Malawian labor activist, researcher, and an academic currently working for Mzuzu University. Holds a Bachelor of Education degree from the University of Malawi and a Master of Arts from Wits University. Before joining the university, he worked for the labor movement. He has done considerable research in social protection and has contributed a chapter in a book, Social Protection in Africa, A Labor Perspective. We have Ms. Consolata Nakata from Ntomburi from Somalia. She's a program officer in social protection with FAO Somalia. She has over 15 years experience and diverse expertise in social protection and humanitarian programming, specializing in analysis of social policies, delivery systems, and capacity strengthening initiatives. Previously, she worked extensively with WFP Kenya in the design and implementation of safety nets, in-kind cash and vouchers, humanitarian initiatives, and monitoring and evaluation and accountability mechanisms. She's a certified master trainer on social protection and has delivered trainings in many countries. She holds a BSc in applied statistics and a master's in project planning and management from the University of Nairobi. We have Maslima Moti, who is from ILO, Geneva, Switzerland. She's a specialist in workers' activities at the United Nations International Labour Organization, based in Geneva, Switzerland. In her portfolio, she coordinates and implements programs and projects for workers' organizations and trade unions across the world on a range of policy areas, including multilateral cooperation and the UN multilateral cooperation and the UN Sustainable Development Policy frameworks, including Agenda 2030, labor provisions in trade and investment agreements, the role economy, and decent work. Her latest research, which includes the impact of COVID-19 on the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 8 and decent work, deficits in the role economy. I welcome you, panelists. So our panel discussion will take it's scheduled here for about 1 hour, 5 minutes. I think I've took about 10 minutes already of that discussion. So I'll open up. Sorry, just looking for that. Since it's a panel discussion, I'll just open up and maybe just take it on a discussion format and say there is the need for assessing enablers and development approaches. Can we have your perspective of in Africa, can we build resilience in social protection and can we achieve development social protection? I'll just use that as a way of opening this discussion. Maybe we'll go first with the gentleman on my immediate right. It's a presentation. So maybe you can. Oh, okay. Because Victor, okay. Okay. So if it's presentations, I can call you to the podium. You can start first with John. Do 15 minutes each, and then the remainder of the time for questions. So you have to come to the.
Thank you. I think is it the 10 minutes? But the 10 minutes, I think, will be, I don't know how to scramble everything down, but we will try. Of course, we have to try to synchronize the informal sector and the economy. And then briefly, I'll touch on a few things which are happened in Malawi in relation to the social protection for the informal sector. So I may be jumping from one slide to the other in trying to align those things and then see what do we expect the civil society to contribute. As it was indicated earlier on, even by Prof. Steve Devereaux, the issues of coverage for social protection for the informal sector remains a huge challenge. So I'll try to see what is happening currently in Malawi, what initiatives have happened, and how can we influence the governments to extend social protection to those who are in real need of coverage. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. Yeah. So briefly, if we look at the history of social protection in Malawi, it also has gone through different stages, and each of those stages came with its own characteristic. So before the independence era, the pre-independence had its own arrangements, which were mainly aligned to the colonial masters in one way or another. But after independent Malawi from 1964 to 1981, there was there was a period where the social protection arrangements took the ways of price controls, universal subsidies, and even the government had an upper hand in controlling the prices of inputs and the like. Markets did not have a major role in trying to control the prices of inputs. When we went in the period between 1981 to 1980, slowly it came a time when the universal subsidies started being phased out. Unfortunately, when these were being phased out, there were no replacements. So it could have the universal subsidies being sieved out, replacements zero, and then those in the informal sector were being slowly being hit by that up until the 1990s and 1994s, where we saw a social facet to the adjustment programs which came in. Well, the issues of the several structural adjustment programs which affected several African countries. And we slowly saw the market-oriented programs and the safety nets coming in terms of projects and the like. And then when in 1994, there was the democratic dispensation in Malawi, there was a major shift in how now the government started to respond to the safety nets. So from a one-party rule in democratic dispensation now, then there were those changes where we saw the introduction of the public works programs, which were not only implemented in Malawi, and most Southern African countries took that route. The issues of cash transfers, the issues of school feeding programs, and the like. So most of these interventions, which continue to date, most of them are means tested, and there are several means tested. The coordination part is also lacking so much. And in the process, we see the issues of areas of exclusion and areas of inclusion where even those whom we feel are not expected to benefit being included at the expense of those who are supposed to benefit. Next slide, please. So when we look at the current situation in Malawi about the coverage, both legal and effective. The legal coverage currently in Malawi, there is no legal provision that cover people in the informal sector. And when we look at the effective coverage, which looks at the number of people benefiting from a given branch of social protection, the several means-tested programs have left out the majority. And we also look at the depth of the benefits. Most of the benefits currently are not adequate. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, that table, it gives just an overview of the current depth of benefits as of April this year in a household with one person. We have a social cash transfer which provides for 4,000 Malawi kwacha per month, and that is in US dollar term. At the time I was coming up with the presentation, it was roughly $4.8 per individual per month. You go to in a family with 2 households, an equivalent of $6 per month. And at the family with 4 and above, we have an average of roughly $9.8 per individual per month. So when you look at the depth of the coverage, we would note that it's not very adequate for the majority. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. So when we look at the informal sector, which we know is currently most excluded in the social protection arrangements, we have to always remember that they also play a crucial part in development. The data presented by Prof. Marius indicated how huge the informal sector is in sub-Saharan Africa. In Malawi, according to the recent data of the Integrated Household Survey of 2019, it gives to close to 90% of the population is in the informal sector. So you cannot leave that huge population out of the economy. You have to find a way on how these people in the informal economy could support our economies. So obviously the social transfers, the social cash transfers, the table which I just showed indicates that the depth of their benefits is low. Much that it is low, but it contributes a lot. Studies done in Malawi, they have proved that within from even those fewer benefits, some people in the informal have managed to change their lives. Others in the rural areas, they're even able to buy livestock from it. So it's an example of without and having something little. So that little thing is helping a lot. And because of that, there is that opportunity if we empower the informal sector, not only through social protection initiatives, there is that possibility of increasing consumption, which has direct impact on the aggregate demand in the economy. And we know the power of aggregate demand in any economy. So those initiatives in Malawi seem to to be having positive effects in the development of the rural areas. Another thing, we have the AIP, from 2020 we call it the AIP, the Affordable Input Program, through which the majority of subsistence farmers in the informal sector are provided with coupons to access a bag of 2 bags of fertilizer and seeds. This has proved to greatly contribute to food security, not only at the individual level, but also at the national level. So in most agricultural economies like Malawi, if you have food security, you are assured of a positive effect on the economy. Next slide, please. So as it stands, coverage of social protection for informal sector still remains low. Then what should be done? How can we make our governments increase the coverage, not only the vertical increase, but as well as the horizontal increase to the informal sector? First, there is need for concerted effort from the civil society. Most often, when issues of social protection are brought to the attention of the public, is where maybe there is a function. So it's something which just ends with public speeches. We talk of social protection today, off we go. We forget probably up until next year. There's this thing happening with ILO. Let's take this campaign. And again, issues of social protection is the issue of human rights. So we have to make sure that citizens are aware of their rights, and as such, they should be able to demand social protection as a right. And we also have to advocate for the abolishment of the projectized way in which social protection issues are handled. Again, we have to call for the institutionalization of a universal basic social protection, for which is very, very crucial, in addition to political will and prudent use of resources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Wezi. Can I call to the podium as its consulate?
Good afternoon, delegates. I am Consultant Toburi from FAO in Somalia. Considering the time limitations, I'll try to be brief with the presentation, looking at integrated approaches to linking social protection and rural development strategies. Next slide, please. So the presentation will focus on looking at the concepts around social protection and rural development, and identifying linkages, ways in which we can build a case for linking social protection to rural development strategies, a little bit of evidence from a pilot we undertook in Somalia, as well as policy recommendations. Next slide, please. So as articulated by Professor Matthias, in Africa, more than 80% of the population lack access to social protection. In fact, according to the World Social Protection Report by ILO, for 2020 to 2022, the coverage in Africa stood at 17.4%. Now, in the COVID times, we realized that about 1 in 10 households in sub-Saharan Africa were reached with COVID measures, often short-term and focused on those who lost their source of livelihoods or employment. Now, this leads us to investigate really the functions of social protection as defined by Stephen, looking at the protective and preventive functions, but more so narrowing it down to the promotive aspect and the transformative aspects of social protection, ensuring that it allows people to escape from poverty, but also sustain themselves beyond poverty. Now, why did we think that it is important to focus on the promotive aspects of social protection? We know that more than 80% of the world's rural are self-employed in the informal sector, and the agri-food system sector presents the highest level of informal employment. So it is important for us to discuss rural development strategies in the perspectives of social protection. Next slide. Now, when we look at, by definition, rural development, we are looking at efforts that lead to improving the quality of life of the rural communities. Rural development adopts a systemic approach, looking at access to basic services, employment, livelihoods, and so on and so forth. And so by definition alone, we see that social protection can actually be an enabler to the realization of rural development priorities. Now, next slide. Now, how are they similar? How is rural development and social protection similar? And why should we advocate for the linkages of the two? One, they are both efforts, ideologies that aim to reduce or alleviate poverty. Two, they are based on common ideologies of universalism, particularly looking at the rural poor, but also in terms of access to basic services, access to protection, as well as comprehensiveness of the benefits that we are looking at. They are also key to development in terms of transitioning humanitarian caseloads to development, but also ensuring that households are able to sustain themselves once they recover from, to sustain themselves beyond the poverty line. Now, rural development and social protection also acknowledge the special role played by women. We know that social protection given to benefits provided to women have greater impact. We also know that women are the biggest contributors in the agri-food systems, and they contribute about 50% of agricultural labor force. Now, conversely, we see that 70% of the small-scale farmers are women, and this means that they are overrepresented in the underpaid, low-paid, seasonal part-time jobs, and hence are often left out when it comes to social protection systems. Now, we also see that this rural development and social protection require a multi-sectoral, multi-dimensional approach for us to realize the priorities and the objectives that we want to achieve. Next slide. Now, and that is why we have agencies like FAO advocating for the linkage of social protection to rural development, as well as food security, but as well creating a platform through which we can have these conversations and support governments to realize this integration. Next slide. Now, when we're talking about the rural economy, we cannot belabor on the challenges that are faced by the rural economy when it comes to accessing social protection. We have just seen that women are underrepresented in social protection and often underrepresented in terms of decent jobs. We're also seeing inadequate and unstable incomes for rural population based on seasonality and production dynamics. We've also mentioned about the highest levels of informality in the rural populations, but also inadequate coverage of schemes, especially when it comes to contributory schemes based on the limitations of income faced by the rural population. Where there are social protection schemes, we often find administrative constraints that hinder the rural populations from accessing the benefits, as well as a lack of a tailored or adaptive social protection programs that are suitable for the rural populates. Next slide. Now, there are various impact pathways through which social protection can impact on rural development. We all know about how social protection stabilizes income, but we have also seen in various countries how this has led to acquiring of productive aspects, engagement in productive labor, as well as improving food security. Next slide. Yes. So there are various instruments, social protection instruments, that have impacts on rural development. To mention but a few, we have a provision of inputs or asset subsidies, labor regulations, particularly in the productive sectors, as well as social insurance and livelihood insurance. Next slide. A few examples of outcomes that have been realized through social protection in terms of outcomes on rural development, agri-food systems and livelihoods. We see in Malawi that some of the cash transfers were used to purchase agricultural assets. In South Africa, there was also resilience in terms of maintaining agricultural production. Next slide. So in Somalia, during the COVID season, we also piloted an intervention where we provided cash, livelihood inputs of beneficiaries' choice, and linked that to nutrition, education, and financial inclusion mechanisms. It was interesting to note that this 24-month project yielded significant positive impacts on the households that we tried to reach, particularly in terms of their resilience capacity, as well as food security indicators. We also realized that they acquired more assets and were able to diversify their livelihood sources. So this goes to say that we have to look at tailored programming for the rural populates, what is needed for them in terms of addressing the informality and supporting them in their livelihoods. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations, we should pursue explicit policy-level integration around rural development and social protection. We should make an effort to embed rural development objectives in social protection and vice versa. In terms of rebuilding back from the pandemic, we require increased and targeted investments in rural development. We must tap into the promotive and the transformative aspects for us to build back better and support the rural population. Also to look at social protection systems, looking at gender responsive and gender sensitive social protection systems that position women at the forefront in terms of receiving assistance, but also in terms of advancing the social protection agenda. We're also looking at advocating for more shock responsive systems, responsiveness in terms of covariate shocks, climate-related shocks, and addressing climate-related challenges. We have to be intentional in these efforts. Next slide. And on my final slide, we have to recognize the role of agri-food systems and traditional livelihoods in creating decent jobs and providing livelihood opportunities to the rural populations. And I believe in this conference, we are going to invest, it's part of investing in global knowledge to inform adaptive social protection. Finally, we must advocate for increased fiscal space to extend social protection to rural populations so that we are able to address poverty, vulnerability, but also increase the resilience of the rural populates who are dependent on our agri-food systems for survival. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I invite Ms. Lema Moti to come to the podium?
Thank you, colleagues, and good afternoon. And I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to SASPEN, the FES in general, for this invitation extended to me personally, but also on behalf of the ILO, and much more on behalf of the ACTRAF, which is the department in the ILO responsible for promoting workers' voices within the ILO policy frameworks. For those of you who maybe don't know, the ILO is the only UN agency that is which is tripartite in nature. So we've got two important departments in the ILO. One that represents and promotes the interest of workers' organizations and trade unions across the world within the ILO, and the other one representing the interests of employers or business, and of course, governments as well. So I come from what we call the ILO Bureau for Workers' Activities. Therefore, I might be speaking, in some sense, a language that is common and well understood by a few colleagues here, very much embedded in trade unionism. Now, I'm going to draw from two important pieces of work that we conducted. One immediately after the pandemic hit us in 2020, the ILO Bureau for Workers' Activity implemented a project or a survey which was looking at the possible impact of COVID-19 on the achievements of SDG 8. Now, one might wonder, why are we focusing on SDG 8? Of course, the ILO is interested in all the goals, and all the goals have got an implication on the world of work and also on the work of trade unions across the world. However, the ILO is the custodian of a number of indicators, SDG indicators, especially target 8.5, which is on achieving full and productive employment and decent work for all men and women, including young persons and persons with disabilities, and equal pay of for equal work of equal value. And of course, linked to that is also the other targets related to average earnings. Of course, we are very interested in wages, decent incomes, livable wages or minimum wages in some cases, issues of youth employment, forced labor, labor rights, and occupational safety and health. The second report, which will be launched actually on the 23rd of May, is called the Decent Work Deficits Among Rural Workers. Now, this is particularly looking at the main question was, to what extent, since we introduced the ILO Decent Work Agenda, has it benefited in practical terms or changed the lives and working conditions of people in rural areas, but more importantly, workers based in rural areas? Now, even within the rural economy, you have formal and informal workers, but of course, as we know, many of them are in the informal economy. Now, I'm trying within the few minutes that I have to basically bring to you the main outcomes of those two studies, and I conclude with what we propose as a way forward. Now, what we've found is that the reality that COVID has brought to us is that the structural problems, economic problems of many countries, especially in Africa and the rest of the developing world, constrained by a number of factors which are structural in nature and systematic. And of course, a lot of our policy approaches have been urban biased. Basically, whatever we do, in many cases, we look at it with an urban lens, and forgetting that in many countries, up to 80% of people live and work in rural economies. And quite a number of them, our report confirmed that despite the GDP growth, the positive GDP growth that has been recorded in many countries, even before the pandemic, rural workers, whether they are in the formal economy or in the informal economy, suffer from severe decent work deficits, including, I'll be okay, governance gaps, underdeveloped production systems, limited access to public services, and inadequate social protection coverage, of course. Whilst we know that agricultural work predominates in the rural economy, we also know that there are other economic sectors that are also present in the rural economy, including mining, for example. And let's not go into the major consequences of mining activities, for example, in many rural areas. Then, of course, the whole question of social protection gaps, which affects a lot of the rural workers, and income protection remains a huge challenge for most rural workers. And the COVID pandemic, for instance, exposed it even further. What we also found is that the income inequalities have grown, but more particularly how it was pronounced through the digital divides. What has happened and what COVID did was to show that quite a number of rural workers have got no access to internet infrastructure or reliable internet infrastructure, for example. Many of them were unable to work from home. So quite a number of us were lucky to be told telework. Yes, we were able to telework and still get paid what is due to us, whether we worked or not. However, that's not the case for the majority of workers, especially those in rural areas or in remote areas of urban centers. So many of them unable to work from home, informal and rural-based workers were faced with a choice either to risk dying from COVID-19 or from hunger. And this is a quote that came from one of the speakers or the trade union representative that we spoke to. So basically, it looked more like when we had the peak of HIV/AIDS pandemic in the 90s, for example, where people would say, you know, HIV will kill me later, but hunger will kill me now. So that's how workers, you know, basically risk their lives during COVID. But what has happened also, it has exposed the safety and health concerns, especially for frontline workers. There was never a time in history when the role of health workers and other frontline workers became more prominent, but also showed the importance and the necessity of quality public services, which must be a must for any country if we are talking about leaving no one behind in line with Agenda 2030. We cannot, you know, bring inclusive and sustainable development when a large number of people have got no access to quality public services, even in a country like South Africa, which is supposed to be one of the most developed countries on the continent. But the crisis has also confirmed that decent work and living wages are pivotal to the sustenance of economies and to cohesive, peaceful, and resilient societies, as countries who have these in place, such as those in the Scandinavian parts of the world and some other parts of the developed world, were able to weather the impact of the crisis much better. Now, where to from here? I was told I have maybe 3 minutes. Let me conclude. But just to say that, as all the speakers from this morning said, COVID is still with us. The responses, the recovery, and how resilient we are has shown the cracks in our policy approaches. There has been unequal, uneven responses and recovery among people, among countries, and among global regions. Now, it is very clear that rural economies and rural workers need urgent rescue. We need retraining and reskilling, and even union protection for rural workers. And why am I talking about reskilling and retraining? Yesterday afternoon, the young man that picked us or welcomed us at the airport, who was sitting in this room, I asked him a question. How were you impacted by COVID? He said, I was retrenched. I lost my job. And I asked him, so what did you do after that? He said, I took up additional training. That's what we are talking about when we're talking about retraining and reskilling, but he did it on his own. We need comprehensive government-supported approaches towards retraining and reskilling because the world of work is changing on a regular basis. Our education systems need to catch up and not the other way around. Now, also the whole question of multilateral approaches to development, and my colleague from FAO spoke about the work that they are doing on social protection. In fact, in the ILO, we are also in the forefront of multilateral approaches to development. We talk about one UN, and maybe colleagues know about the UN reforms, where from now on, all UN agencies have to be collaborating much more closely at national level. Within the ILO, we are working with the UN, with the FAO, on what we call approaches to the informal economy, to make sure that there is proper transitions from informal to formal economy. And we are also working with the UNDP on social protection, because no UN agency can do this alone. We all have strength, but also have weaknesses, and together we can do better. But maybe I must conclude to say that the whole financing for development agenda is very critical. Domestic resource mobilization, how we deal with the questions of taxation within countries, especially in Africa. It is important that we call for strengthening social protection systems to reduce inequalities, to adapt to shocks, and support just and inclusive transitions. And finally, important to move beyond a focus on urban centers and ensure that employment opportunities are created for people everywhere, and especially for young people in rural areas. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilma. Naka, do we have Dr. Issa Kabelenga online? So maybe you can connect him, and for 15 minutes, 10 minutes, I'm being told 10 minutes, sorry, Doc. You have to cut you short for him to then conduct his presentation.
Good afternoon to everyone from Lusaka, Zambia. I don't know if the participants are able to hear me, please. Okay, thank you. So I'm here to present to you the voices of the informal economy workers in Zambia during COVID-19 pandemic, about what the government of Zambia should do in order to build comprehensive, strong, and sustainable social protection for informal economy workers. I hope that this presentation is something which even in other countries, not just in SADC, but across the world that are watching us, can learn something on how to build comprehensive, strong, and sustainable social protection for informal economy workers. And what I'm presenting basically here is not my voice, but rather is actually the voices of the informal economy workers in Zambia. And this study was actually undertaken in Zambia from August 2020 to almost June 2021, where we engaged a lot of informal economy workers about what should be done in order to build comprehensive, strong, and sustainable social protection for informal economy workers in Zambia. And that was because despite the emergence of COVID-19 in Zambia, there were inadequate studies that were undertaken in Zambia in order to establish the views of the informal economy workers in Zambia about what should be done in order to build comprehensive, strong, and sustainable social protection. Interesting to mention here also is that actually this study was undertaken in conjunction with the Frederick Ebert think tank, and this the study which involved about 18 associations of the informal economy workers, and in total that accounted for almost 200,000 informal economy workers. Specifically, the methodology used hermeneutic phenomenology approach. And maybe for the sake of those that might not be familiar with that qualitative research approach, the hermeneutic phenomenology approach is the qualitative approach where you get the common experiences about something. So in this study, we wanted to establish what was common among all the 18 associations of the informal economy workers, with a view of trying to establish the impacts of COVID-19 on their social protection and what they felt should be done in order to build strong, comprehensive, strong in order to build comprehensive, strong, and sustainable social protection. So the participants were many, just as I said. There were Association for Informal Economy Workers, and in total we conducted about 41 interviews, which involved 36 individual interviews and 5 focus group discussions. And the study was undertaken in 6 districts of Zambia, for which 2 were rural and 4 were urban. However, before I present the findings of the study to you about what they feel should be done, let me just briefly present to you about what they said about the impacts of COVID-19 on themselves and their members. In the findings of our study, it is evident that in both rural and urban Zambia, COVID-19 had negatively affected all categories of informal economy workers in similar ways. And that was because COVID-19 brought about either weakening or total destruction of the economic and social activities of the informal economy workers at all the levels of the Zambian economy. An interesting finding was that COVID-19 was not just actually weakening or killing the lives of the informal economy workers in Zambia, but rather it was also weakening and killing the informal social protection for informal economy workers. As my brothers from Malawi was presenting, he said that the informal economy workers are not adequately covered by state form of social protection. Is the same situation here in Zambia. So informal economy workers, they depend so much on informal social protection, which they've devised for themselves. Unfortunately, in our study, it is evident that even the informal social protection, which informal economy workers have devised for themselves, it has ended up being weakened or destroyed by the COVID-19. So that is a very, very important, I think, finding from this study. And according to the participants, those impacts were attributed to lack of strong social protection for informal economy workers. And on the basis of the above impacts, the participants were asked to state what the government of Zambia and other stakeholders should do in order to build comprehensive, strong, and sustainable social protection for informal economy workers. The study has established 4 interesting social protection interventions, which, if implemented according to the participants, will make Zambia to have comprehensive, strong, and sustainable social protection. And the following were the recommendation or the suggestions. The first one was that there was need to simultaneously build homegrown social protection or indigenous social protection at individual, household, and local community levels. So to them, what is needed is to build a multi-layered approach to formal social protection. So it's not one form of social protection, but rather a multi-layered form of social protection, which should start at individual informal economy worker, it should go to household level, and then it should go to local communities where these informal economy workers are found. And you can see for yourselves there, one of the verbatim quotes which I cited, but in the interest of time, I'll not be able to read it. Next slide, please. They also felt that what is needed also is to build what is called as the district-based social protection for informal economy workers. Zambia is divided, I think, into 4 levels. There is what we call the national level, there is what we call the provincial level, then there is the district level, and then there is the community or household level. So according to them, they feel that informal economy workers, they operate at district level. And because of that, they feel that there is need to have every district of Zambia to have got its own social protection reserves, so that in an event of calamities like COVID-19, the informal economy workers in that particular district should quickly go to those forms of social protection where they can be shielded against the effects of calamities like COVID-19. Next slide, please. They also recommend that there is need to build what is called, to come up with what is called informal sector category-based form of social protection. As you may be all aware, you should not think that informal economy workers are an homogeneous group of workers. Rather, it is an heterogeneous group of workers. So it's a multiple. There are many actors that are involved in social protection, and according to them, each category of informal economy workers has got its own social protection needs. And the way those needs should be addressed, they should be different from any other categories. And in their own thinking, that is the only way you can have a strong, comprehensive, and sustainable form of social protection. Maybe let me read to you this verbatim quote, because I believe that it has significant implications in the way we think about the informal economy and some of the forms of social protection that we can be thinking about on how to extend social protection to informal economy workers. I read this quote: each category of informal economy workers should have got its own form of social protection. This is because each category has got its own social protection needs, which are different from other categories. For example, taxi and bus drivers, they need fuel and tax exemptions from road transport and safety agents. Clearing and forwarding agents need Zambia Revenue Authority to cancel all the dues that agency are owing, among others. So you are able to see that
Sorry, Doc.
this group of workers is
Dr.
quite broad.
Kabelenga.
And because of that, you need to think about that in order to build comprehensive
Sorry,
and
Dr.
strong social
Kabelenga, I
protection.
think we have to cut you short because in the essence of time, so I'll just give you just a minute just to summarize your last thoughts so we can open up for 1 or 2 questions and move to the next session, please.
Thank you. So let me just conclude that the last intervention that the informal economy workers are demanding for is to establish a stand-alone national social protection institution for informal economy workers. So like the way it is with formal workers, they have got their own forms of social protection. They also demand that they also need to have their own form of social protection. So to conclude from what I've presented, you are able to see that informal economy workers, they are demanding for a multi-layered form of social protection. We are also able to see that they are demanding for what is called diversified form of social protection. So there is need to diversify social protection for informal economy workers. And the thinking is that in an event that one form of social protection fails, they should depend on other forms of social protection. And that is the only way you can extend coverage of social protection.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
finally, from what I've presented, we are able to see that
Dr. Kabelenga.
informal economy workers in Zambia, they
Hello?
hold the view that one size fits all form of social protection does not exist. Okay? One size fits all form of social protection does not exist, but rather it's multi-layered approach which should be taken. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kabelenga. Okay, that was a very intense round of presentations. So I'll just take maybe 1 or 2 questions, burning questions for our presenters. Yes, one from Richard. Do you have any other burning question? Yes, 2 questions. And Richard, you can come forward. And then, yeah, okay, you can start. Sorry, Richard. Yeah, and please, Richard, reduce it to 30 seconds. They said 1 minute, but for you, I'll do it to 30 seconds.
That is the politics of social protection. Panelists, Ongera, that means well done. Indeed, listening to the 4 of you making your presentations, one, of course, realizing that the informal economy, that almost 90% of the workers in sub-Saharan Africa are in the informal economy, then one would realize the need and of course appreciate that it is the informal. Actually, what happened in the informal, they didn't lose employment, they were locked out of employment. So when we are talking about lockdown, Because their jobs, if you look at their jobs, they are risk jobs, and that's why you have called them frontline workers. But again, the question that we have to ask ourselves, and Consolata, you brought it up and said, the people that suffered most were the women. Indeed, if you look at it, the COVID-19 measures, the social protection measures, did not have a gender component.
Okay, I think I'll cut you short.
And just before you cut me short, really, you cut me short, because I've not talked about Ilma.
Oh,
I've not
because
talked about
we
Kaberenge.
are really behind schedule.
No, just two things. Now, Ilma, it is important. I wanted to hear more about how do we promote social dialogue. I wanted to hear about social dialogue and decent work. Because then that is the only way. Because when we talk about tripartite and the role of ILO, I would have wished to hear how we could have used social dialogue to reduce the locking out of the informal during the COVID-19 period. Dr. Kaberenge.
Richard, I think I'm
The
going
last
to
one.
use my powers
Just
as
the last
the
one.
chairperson, please.
You
We
allow-
are really behind.
You allow Dr. Kaberenge. Right, Dr. Kaberenge. It is important that as we think about the informal and as we think about diversification, that we look at delivery of social protection to the informal in terms of accessibility, adaptability, availability, and flexibility. And of course, awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to have the next question, and please try and keep it short.
Okay, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
I think the presenters, all the presenters, let me say the panel, particularly also the lady who spoke from the Zambian Republic. Mine is actually to say, and the chairperson put it nicely at another session, that we were not prepared for COVID. It's just that things happened. We tried our best, trial and error, but I think we have learned. So to me, it will be important that for such a conference or going forward, it's only that we did not have time. We should be saying, how do we prepare therefore? How do we build adaptive and shock responsive social protection going forward? That we invest on the energies of devising strategies of how do we get, particularly the informal sector. My question would be, for example, the relationship, the administrative relationship between the informal sector or the non-poor or informal. What is the arrangement between them and governments? And where do they meet with governments? I think at the end of it all, we need to come with such answers. What are their needs? How do we bring them to the supply chain? Because as long as they are informal, they are doing their best. But if they are also kicked away out of the national supply chain mechanisms, they might not survive going forward. The last one from my side is the issue I've listened even since the morning. Is government them and government them? Where is the corporate citizen? What is the role of the private sector in all this? Because we need to interrogate that on that and find out. Because sometimes the private sector is interested, but sometimes you find that the government legislation sometimes prohibits, or they are not even consulted on what they could be doing. And piggybacking on that, it should also be the issue. When we talk of recovery, the social worker, where is the social worker? How was he or she impacted? Did anybody, how do we assist them? That we need to be having a session. I'm not saying today or any other time, but that is a topic to say the social workers. If you come from a country like mine, Botswana, where each little village has a social worker, very far away from anything, how do we support her or him in such a situation? Those are the topics I'll be interested that the network should interrogate going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I'll afford the respective panelists to answer, maybe very briefly. think one of the questions was directed at Kata and the other one at Helma, if I got it correctly. No, I think for them to hear you, but yes. So maybe after you, then the other one can come and answer the question without any interjection from me. Thank you.
You are the one I was talking about. So this is the young man I was talking about earlier. So well, anyway, I was hoping I don't get any question from Richard. But thanks for the question, Richard. In fact, that's the point that was the last point I wanted to make. But in the interest of time, I didn't, point it out. I thought it was a given. But you're right. No sustainable development can be achieved without, proper social dialogue, inclusive social dialogue. Now, but there are a lot of challenges also in terms of union participation in social dialogue, and especially on issues that are not necessarily directly so-called bread and butter issues. We have huge capacity constraints within the trade union movement in terms of how, their capacity to engage constructively in some of these, discussions. But that does not mean they should be excluded. I think it's important that we help trade unions build their capacities to be able to engage constructively. Now, the challenge we have also with union participation in policy formulation, sometimes it only happens maybe at the beginning of the formulation of a policy, and often there is no participation of trade unions in the, bringing them along in the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And in fact, from our department perspective, it is very important that trade unions participate from their conception through to, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And it's important that we continue building the capacities of trade unions internally to be able to engage consistently, but also constructively. Because one of the challenges that we've been trying from our side now to really introduce the whole question of social partnerships to the broader UN family, because not many UN agencies or UN leaders even understand what social partnership is. So we've been working hard to make them understand the role of trade unions, and sometimes even breaking it down to the most basic level, to make sure they understand what trade unions stand for and why it's important that they participate in these processes at all levels. So I think I'll end there, but more importantly to say that, but we have work to do as trade unions. Indeed, we have a lot of external forces against trade unions, but it's important that we also look into the internal challenges facing trade unions themselves, the enemy within. And sorry that maybe I might not be politically correct, but I think important that trade unions also they consider how best they can transform the leadership within trade unions, because that's one of the biggest challenges that leads to lack of progress within the movement, and also then their inadequate capacity to participate in policy processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for your comments. I will attempt to respond to the question on administrative arrangements. How do we get the informal sector to engage? I think what we're saying is we are advocating for universal programs. From a rights-based perspective, coverage should be universal. But we're also saying that it is important for us to look at how we tailor social protection programs to augment the impacts for specific populations. And we're not advocating for graduation programs. We are looking at social protection from a rights-based perspective. Everyone is eligible to receive benefits. But also, how do we broaden that scope? How do we make our systems adaptive to the needs of the rural populations? Thank you.
Thank you. Probably just to comment on how to bring the informal sector to the main supply chain. Otherwise, probably the way to formalize the informal sector is probably by bringing in regulations which would be friendly to the informal sector. Otherwise, most of the current regulations, in most countries, they even push the informal sector further. In the informal sector, someone is there to survive. But then if we bring in a lot of regulations which are an impediment to them, we do not think there could be a way anytime sooner for the informal sector to willingly try to formalize their activities. There's another question: how could the private sector be engaged in the provision of social protection? Currently, if we see, I think most of the private sector is involved in profit making. They're trying maybe just bringing in insurance schemes, which unfortunately are, by their very nature of their contributor arrangements, they seem to be not very friendly to the informal sector, who are there just to survive. So we really have to interrogate this: how can that corporate part of the private sector be extended to the informal sector? Thank you.
Okay, just to close up the session, all I have to say is in your initiatives in bringing the informal sector and rural communities on board, let their voices be heard. Nothing without them, for them. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your indulgence. Let's give a round of applause for the presenters. Thank you.